All right, so when we talk about democracy, the question on the screen is what makes some countries democratic and other countries not? So generally when we start having this discussion, a country can sort of be defined as a democracy when it has the following kind of broad categories can be found in a country. So number one, there's a general acceptance of what we sort of refer to as democratic values, what we value, what we appreciate, which we're going to talk about shortly. There's a certain political process in place, i.e., right, voting, right? If you're trying to say, okay, people have a voice in their government, there's a voting process. And then usually we have to make sure that there's types of structure in place. So checks on power, making sure that there's not one branch or group or individual that's able to sort of, pull the power, that it's sort of kept in balance through this beautiful, beautiful dream of democracy in that case. So let's talk about more of the values. So there, we can, if I asked you the question, right, we could pause and think about, okay, what in a democracy do we value? Lots of thoughts probably come to your mind. So there's 4 values that underlie all democracies. I think most of what I would have you brainstorm in class would probably fall into one of these main categories. So for example, right, personal liberty. So when we start looking at our cornerstone democracy documents, right, if we look at Declaration of Independence, right, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sort of the ability to live your life and not have any sort of unreasonable, now that's where it gets sticky nowadays, right, unreasonable government interference. Now, from depending on different perspectives, right, one person could say the government is not doing enough. One other person would say government's isn't doing too much. So that gets very hotly debated in a democracy. We also say in a democracy, right, respect for the individual, right, individual rights, individual opportunity. So those rights that we'll sort of explore when we get into our, First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, assembly, petition, press, right, all the basic foundations. Equality of opportunity, right? Everybody has an opportunity. Everybody has a pathway. There's nothing in place that's oppressive or a structure that's sort of limiting people's possibilities of realizing their goals. And the last one also is popular consent. So this concept, right, that the government derives its power from the people. So we can't stray away from that concept. So popular consent or popular sovereignty, which we'll be exploring, is that concept that really is a cornerstone of democracy. Now, as far as the process goes, to be a successful democracy, governments have these sort of well-defined processes to incorporate. So we look at free and fair elections as something that must be in place. Majority and plurality rule government according to the express views of the majority. So that just simply means majority rule, right? If I say, okay, let's take a vote, okay, group that has the most, right, they're the ones that get the voice or the power. Freedom of press. That is also something, again, in our recent era has been hotly contested, right? The concept of freedom of press and how we balance that with sort of real news or true news or the counter argument of fake news, but the ability for people to sort of access information and the ability of journalists to provide us with that, and it's not structured or censored by the government in any way. Freedom of assembly and protest, the right to organize for political purposes. So in that case, right, the government cannot restrict that. It is a right that is given, and it allows the people to make changes and fight for things that need to be negotiated or worked out or developed or improved in our society. So with those things in place, we really kind of, look at it through the lens of this is the process that allows democracy to thrive, to sort of grow, to kind of, live and breathe and develop as we need it to see through. All right, and then we have our democratic structure, which we'll definitely be spending some time in class talking about the structure. So for example, in our country, right, we talk about the U.S. Constitution separates power into 3 branches of government. So to simplify this, right, we'll be exploring our legislative branch, which ultimately is going to create and write the laws for our country. The executive branch, which is our president, which is going to enforce the law of the land. Judicial branch is going to make sure that laws are interpreted and that there's fairness and justice throughout the courts. And the way the Constitution is written, of course, is written in a way to make sure that there's a check There's a way to prevent if one branch oversteps or tries to reach for too much power or too much control. There's sort of a balancing act that takes place. In addition to that, the Bill of Rights, which we'll be looking at, right, the amendments to the Constitution, right, allows the Constitution to sort of grow with our country. So constitutions, right, written, and we look back at it, and we will, of course, things have changed as far as who gets a voice, who gets to vote, who gets rights, who's considered a citizen, who's protected under these laws, right? That has definitely evolved over our nation's history. So with the Bill of Rights, it's basically an agreement that we have with the government that they cannot take away those rights and things the government cannot do to us in that case. All right, some other things that we'll be exploring when we think about democracy is conditions that make our democracy a little bit easier. So we think about, right, how are we going to make sure that this system continues on and functions properly as a government that controls us, protects us, provides for us, right? Number one, of course, what we're doing here, folks, is that education, right? If we're preparing you to be citizens that are going to be active participants in the civic arena, we want to make sure that you're intelligent, you're well-read, you're able to sort of develop opinions that are grounded in evidence. You're able to look at the facts, sort of read between the lines, really sort of construct your own individual opinion, and make sure you're able to have that foundation so you can make proper decisions, well-informed decisions, whatever they may be, when you go to that sort of voting ballot. Economic, so relatively prosperous nations, right? Equitable distribution of wealth. That provides for the best context in a democracy. When we look at about economic inequality in our own country, one could argue perhaps against some of the struggles of our own democracy could be rooted in some of that economic tension. And we'll definitely see how we sort of navigate those waters. But again, we have that sort of distribution of wealth that does create tension and friction within a democracy. Social, how united are the people? Is there common ground that can be reached? As I record this lecture, I think that's an area of growth. I think for most of us, we would say that is something that we are working towards. We're in a period of history which is definitely divided. And the last one right there, again, ideological divisions. Is a democracy accepted to be a viable system to the people of that country? You know, the belief in the sense that democracy is working, that government is there. I would also say there's been a lot of talk about questions of government, questions of people in charge, questions of people, their voice in government. So we have to think about these things. This isn't something that just isn't, again, definitions or concepts from the textbook, which we'll be exploring. It really is something that we can apply and kind of look at and almost, decides for ourselves what conditions are going to be easier.